In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger Livecast.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to you on behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger and Stichting Verhalende Journalistiek. A very warm welcome who's watching this livecast on Facebook, but also everybody who's watching us on Salto TV. My name is Jurgen Chonnafong and I'm your moderator tonight. This month, Pakhuis de Zwijger will join forces with Stichting Verhalende Journalistiek. And they will focus about the craft of storytelling and how to apply narrative techniques. During this series of livecasts, we will talk to the creators of impactful journalistic productions from all over the world. We'll discuss how they have used narrative techniques successfully without losing their journalistic integrity, of course. And in this episode, we'll talk about the making of this book, She Said, a very impactful book that had made news worldwide. They reached the headlines everywhere. If you would like to join into our conversation, that is possible. Go to the program page on dezwijger.nl, and if you log in there through Zoom, you can make use of the Q&A function. And there you can direct your questions to the guests that we have here in our studio and joining us here through Zoom. Make sure that you mention who your question is directed to so I can make sure that the right person gets the right question. Now, for our main guest, we're very happy that she's joining us, Rebecca Corbett, because people who would say that two women had broken the Weinstein story. But it had really been three. That's what Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey wrote in She Said, the book on their award-winning investigation. The third woman, of course, is Rebecca Corbett, who leads the investigations department at the New York Times. As an editor, Corbett supervised every step of the process. She paired up Kantor and Twohey, and she encouraged them to keep their eyes on the bigger story. A very warm welcome to you, Rebecca Corbett. Are you there?
I am. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be speaking tonight.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have to say it's an honor for you to join us and tell us a little bit more about investigative journalism. We'll return to you in a bit, but first I would like to introduce our second guest. And she has been the chief editor at the Groene Amsterdammer since 2008. It's, of course, Xandra Schutte. She has written extensively about literature, about art, about feminism, and she has published several essays on sociological issues. And in 2016, she won the Gouden Ganzenveer, which is a Dutch literature prize for her contribution to the written and printed word in Dutch. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Did you read the book?
Yeah, I read the book in 2019, and actually it was one of my favorite books in our end of the year special in 2019, because I think it's also an excellent journalistic book, because well, when reading it, also for non-professionals, you really get an impression how hard work it is to get such scoops.
Right. We'll get more in depth about the making of, but first I would like to show you a clip about the impact of She Said.
Really good. This is one spectacle that Harvey Weinstein never wanted to produce. His upcoming criminal trial on sex charges now scheduled for January. It could be the final act for the 67-year-old disgraced movie mogul who has already lost his business, his marriage, and his Midas touch, in large part because of the work of two New York Times reporters.
This was an example of journalism stepping in where other systems had failed. And one question that we've pursued from the beginning is, how did this producer manage to rack up 40 years of allegations without anybody finally stopping it?
In a series of articles beginning in October 2017, Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor told stories of how Harvey Weinstein had pushed, even forced, women who worked for him into unwanted physical contact.
Nobody was immune from sexual harassment. Even the most famous, shiny women and celebrities, including people like Ashley Judd and Gwyneth Paltrow, had been victims of this themselves.
Weinstein has consistently said all the encounters were consensual. In a new book, Cantor and Toohey go into detail about what they uncovered and how difficult it was to get women who said they had been victimized to go public.
Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yes, this is just a very short clip about the great impact the book, the story had. Rebecca, if I can call you Miss Corbett, can I call you Rebecca?
You may call me Rebecca, please do.
Thank you so much. When watching this clip, what do you feel? Because this is a story you're very much responsible for as well. How does that make you feel looking back on it?
Well, it's interesting. October this month has been the 3rd anniversary of the investigation. And when we started out on this, we didn't know that there was a record of misconduct by Harvey Weinstein. We didn't know that there was a there. There had been a few rumors and a few attempts by other journalists, including someone at the Times, over the years to look into this, but nothing had ever materialized and really been confirmed. And none of us involved in this at the paper anticipated the sort of worldwide reckoning over sexual, workplace sexual harassment and sexual abuses that it helped prompt. So it's still, even in retrospect, it seems pretty amazing that what began as a question that grew out of some of other work we had been doing about sexual harassment, really exploded in the way that it has, and has had some real impact.
Right. You brought Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey together. When did you have a hunch that this really is a story that could make news? Maybe not worldwide like it has, but is it an instinct that you have to trust, or does it work in another way?
Well, it was a couple of things. One, that what we often do with stories, we get tips through our tip line, we hear things, but, we began the Weinstein story after a discussion at the paper. The Times broke a story about Bill O'Reilly, this conservative talk show host, who it turned out had paid settlements over the years to hush up women who claimed that he had sexually harassed them. And so we were engaged in a conversation about, well, is this a much more widespread problem? Are there other men in other industries we should look at? So we began asking some questions, and we had one reporter looking into things in Silicon Valley. Other people were looking at low-wage workers. But Jodi had raised the question of Weinstein and the entertainment industry. And what we often do is ask someone, a reporter, to do exploratory reporting. Go see, what you can find out, and then we'll reassess in just a couple weeks. And even though in those first few weeks, no one told her anything that was in any way publishable, she got enough hints that there might well be something there. And so she continued for a couple of months, and, piece by piece began getting at least knowing who she should talk to, and getting hints that, there might be, a rather significant group of women that might know something about this, and some names surfaced. And it became clear to me that in order to do this story in an efficient way, and also because it's hard to do stories like this alone, because you have to do a lot of strategizing, and sometimes you're going into completely different lanes, that it's just really helpful to have a partner. And Megan, in fact, was on maternity leave when Jodi started on this, but I knew she was coming back in several months. And they have some overlapping skills, but they also have some very complementary skills. They're both great reporters. They're both, great at going deep on stories. Megan is a more classic investigative reporter, sort of laser focused, and very good at the, sort of confrontational interview. Jodi is really great at, sort of persuading, people to talk, making them comfortable, telling their stories. So, they made a really great team.
And it's
they didn't even know each other well at all.
Right, and it's combining the strength, so getting the hints and the hunches that there is a story there, and the next step is combining those forces in order to get the greatest result in that sense.
Yes, and it's not unusual in our group at the paper, the investigations team. We often team up, so there are stories we've done with much larger groups of people involved, but typically, there's small groups or individuals.
Right. Let's take a little step back, because your job title is investigations editor, and together with a colleague, you lead the investigations department at the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And what does that role exactly entail?
Well, traditionally, the investigations department did all or most of the long-running investigations at the paper. Investigative journalism, of course, has greatly expanded across journalism, and we have investigative reporters in many departments of the paper. But the department has been the traditional home of it, and there are a lot of stories that departments can't take on because they're too busy keeping up with the news. In some cases, the reporters who are beat reporters, don't have the time or don't always want to be involved in investigative stories. They can take a very long time, and they do not always pay off. Sometimes you spend a lot of time and effort on a story and you hit a wall, or you realize that, the premise is wrong, whatever. But we do a lot of the premier investigative reporting at the paper, and have long done that.
Right. And the thing is that for this investigation, they had a window of not a window, but they took 18 months in order to get the story correct. And this is a reality that we can here only dream of. Is that commonplace that you can take so much time for the story, or does that depend on how big this impact of the story is going to be?
How many months did you say?
18, I believe.
No. It was started in April or May, and we published in October. So it was 6 to 7.
Right.
But there have been others that have taken way longer. And for example, our team published a story the next year, which took more than a year. It was about Trump's finances and how his whole narrative of being a self-made businessman was not true. Most of his wealth had come from his father. And then we just published a month ago, or was it earlier this month, a story about Trump's taxes, his whole history of tax avoidance, and that story took several reporters, I think nearly a year.
Right.
So
it's still, that's a very fortunate that you can take so much
Yes.
time. When is the moment that you decide this is not a story that we are going to publish, and in what way does it hurt to let a story go? Is there a go or no go moment that you have to decide that?
Yes, and it often comes up. And by the way, just to back up 1 minute, we do some quick turnaround stories, and sometimes stories that are done in a day, and sometimes stories that are done in a few weeks. So not everything, and we know it's a real luxury to be able to spend months on stories. But there often comes a time where, again, you either got a tip or we decided, like, let's look more deeply into this and see if there's a there. And sometimes you're able to answer that question pretty quickly after a week or two of reporting. Sometimes there's enough that seems promising that you keep at it, and the potential importance of the story compels us to continue. And sometimes you think you're there, and then when you look at all the evidence that's compiled and you can't, make a persuasive case, those are moments where we have to say, okay, we're not going to do this story. We can't do it unless there's more information. But at this point, we don't think, further reporting is necessary. Sometimes there are stories where you're not at the quite right moment to do them. And then we go back, some months or even a couple years later, and the situation has changed, and that early reporting helps lead us to a really great story.
But it must
but
hurt
it's painful.
if you have
It's
to let
painful to
something...
say.
Yeah, it's painful.
Yes.
And what's your role exactly during that process? Because you described yourself, or somebody said, Rebecca functions as a supporter, a strategist, a skeptic, and a safety net at the same time.
Well, I think it's the way that most editors function, but it's a little more probably intense with investigative reporting because partly reporters can't share a lot of the information with other people and even their fellow journalists because some of the information is so sensitive. Sometimes it's that you're sort of grappling with complicated material and complicated questions of how can we report this, because often you're dealing with sources that you have to protect, and you can't just go ask everybody, that would know about the subject about it because of the risk of exposing sources. Often it involves documents that can be pretty, dense and complicated, and you really have to be able to discern the patterns of it. So it's a lot of questioning. It's a lot of, okay, explain this to me. I mean, I just got off a call before this program started where it's a story that a couple reporters have been involved in for about a month, a little more. And that, there was one understanding about the role a certain character played, and because of questions that arose from me and in our own discussions, they did some more reporting. It sort of changed our thinking about it. So it's a lot of listening, asking questions, making suggestions, and, saying even when you're sort of hitting a rough patch where nothing is working, it's like believing if there, you really are confident that there's a story there, believing that we can get to the other side.
How much?
We don't always, but we try to do fairly often.
And how much involvement do you have in the story itself? Do you know? You probably don't know about every detail, but what's the level of inclusion that you have for yourself?
I tend to be a pretty hands-on person. Like, firstly, as an editor, you have to live vicariously through your reporters where they go. Occasionally, on some occasions, I will join interviews, but I don't usually do it every week, and so it's both interesting to me to figure out, what information they have and to understand what they're uncovering. But it's also satisfying to help shape these stories and help push them along.
Right. Thank you so much for now. I would like to mirror our Dutch situation, how things work here. And Xandra, you obviously are very hands-on as well when creating the Groene. If you listen to the story that Rebecca just shared with us, is this a construction that we know in the Netherlands? Is that something that we can, have parallels to?
Well, I don't know exactly how it works at newspapers. Of course, our magazine is the other way of the spectrum. If you compare it with the New York Times, we have 10. We were working with an editing board of 10 staff writers and 2 or 3 junior reporters. So that's very small. We work a lot with freelance journalists, freelance reporters, and of course we let them come to our offices. We talk a lot, but they are more on a distance, and very often it's for them to take the risk to make the decision go or no go, because when you don't know how much time making an investigative story will cost, very often we need extra funding. So that's one of my tasks as well, helping with thinking where you can get extra funding, writing letters to get it. And well, what Rebecca is describing, it's part of my work, but I'm doing a lot more. Well, I think
Are
most
you
of
as involved in the story as Rebecca is?
Not in so many details, and it depends. In our investigated stories, we also work with duos or three journalists working together, because then they help each other, and it's also to prevent tunnel vision. Yeah. But most of the time, I'm working with young reporters who have to learn the branch. And well, I always joke that the Groene Amsterdammer, our magazine, is Ajax, the soccer club in Dutch journalism, because a lot of reporters start young at our magazine, and they learn very well to write stories, to do investigative journalism. And then one of the big newspapers come and they're buying them away.
They steal you. You train them and other people steal them away.
That's the difficulty, that we don't often have too much time to work together with very experienced reporters. And of course, it depends on the story. When it's very vulnerable, I will be more involved, but I'm especially involved at the beginning of a story. When you're talking about what's the hypothesis, how will you do the investigation, and then, well, only in between when there are real problems, and when there are editors at our magazine, they come popping in my room, and they will tell about special meetings, and well, else it's more at the end of the story.
Yeah, so your involvement difference with the different stories. Rebecca, if I can go back to you, you explained that you're very hands-on and you're very involved in a story. When building the narrative, are you involved in building the narrative as well?
Well, we're involved in that we always have discussions about how we're going to tell this story, how we were going to write this story, and we often ask reporters to write outlines that we then discussed. I was just doing that again in this call before this program. We often talk about, like, let's talk about the top of the story, and, you know, what is your idea for this, and what are the, you know, the nut graphs, what are the conclusions that we have to present early on in the story. So yes, I mean, discussing how the story is told is a huge part of what we do, you know, as editors. And, you know, some stories, it's hard to do. Some investigative stories have to be written in a very hard news sort of way. You can't tell this sort of beautiful narrative where you have a main character and whatever. But we try to make stories as engaging and as powerful as possible. And even when a story is not a narrative all to itself, there are bits of narratives in stories that can really help make them more accessible and powerful to readers.
Right, and what was very it had a risk. The story had a risk as well, because you of course didn't know how it would play out. So the sources that you used and the women that, you know, shared their stories were very vulnerable. And was there a fear of victim blaming, that, you know, Weinstein's power didn't, you know, didn't disappear, but he would exercise his power, and the women would be even more the victim than before the story? Was that involved in your decision making or in the way you told the story?
Yes, that obviously, when you're dealing with sensitive material like claims of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct and other sexual abuses, you're dealing with obviously very intimate material, often that women had never shared with anyone else. And that what we were trying to establish, because I mean, there has been coverage of sexual harassment and misconduct by journalists for years, but it was often about one case, one man, and that without evidence from the scene, often it was unreported, most typically unreported. And so it's very hard to prove just that something happened in one episode without ways to corroborate it. And therefore it did not have a lot of impact. And, there's reasons that sexual harassment has persisted, for decades, centuries, actually, and reasons it still, persists.
Right.
But
those patterns are really difficult to break. And I think, am I correct that She Said and the whole Me Too movement broke those patterns? Because I saw an interview with Anita Hill just recently, who looked back on the revelation she had when she broke the story, and she was actually blamed for what happened.
Right.
That didn't really happen with the Me Too affair, and not with She Said, or did it?
Well, I think for the most part that it helped get over a barrier, and the idea that it helped because we felt that we could really only build a case with on-record accounts, and it couldn't be anonymous accusers, it required us to show that there was a pattern of behavior, so it didn't just come down to one woman's word. And it also in many cases made women feel less shame about talking about it. And I think that's what the real cultural shift that happened with this, with the Me Too movement, that women felt that they could tell their stories and be believed. And it was pretty amazing, I thought, after the story broke, not only like the torrent of other tips that came about other men and, throughout the world, other news organizations doing these stories, but that women were telling people they knew, their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their work colleagues, and men were shocked to hear that so many women had stories of, sexual harassment or some misconduct, and women had never told them about it. And it made men realize just how extensive the problem was, and that the shame that many women felt about it.
And could you say that this is the power of investigative journalism? This is what it can bring about, or was it just an incident and that won't happen soon again?
Well, I don't know what would be the next category of story that where that might happen, but I think that the purpose and power of investigative journalism is to provide accountability, to reveal misconduct, to expose, problems that affect a lot of people. So I would say, yes, that's exactly sort of the power of investigative journalism, and the power of people feeling protected in doing so, that, we didn't force anyone to do anything they didn't want to do in terms of coming forward. Yeah. But we made it safe by doing so, by providing corroboration to their account and that of others, as much as we possibly could.
Right. And again, in this Dutch situation, because things are differently, do you think that investigative journalism can play the same role in Holland, or is it different?
Well, I think it can play the same role. We didn't break the Me Too stories. In the slipstream, of course, there were Me Too stories here as well. And unfortunately, not as good as that in the New York Times, because what I like so much and admire so much in how the New York Times dealt with the Weinstein stories is the structural approach, and that you could see that there is that expression: you need a village to raise a child, or you need a village to abuse a woman, because there are a lot of people around knowing and looking away, well, of course, there
and men as well. I mean, we had a Dutch scandal here.
Men as well, and of course, there was that whole story of settlements, and that's something we don't know. No. And in the slipstream of Me Too in the US, we got our own stories, but it was very much about one man and one rotten apple, and I didn't like that stories because. It was only very very simple scandal and not structural story.
Right. In the second part of this conversation, we will talk about how to form a narrative into investigative reporting. But first, I would like to listen to an audio clip where. The moment we're going to hear is just before publication, and the two journalists are going to discuss and how they will coordinate and how they will present the results to Weinstein. It's a very interesting insight into the role of supervision and editing in research stories. Let's have a listen to that.
Presenting findings was standard journalistic practice, the right way to treat any story subject, even a completely untrustworthy one. But the group could not settle on how much time to give Weinstein to respond. They would need to provide him with a deadline. Here's how long you have until we publish. But once Weinstein knew what the Times planned to publish, he could pressure women into recanting, intimidate others into contradicting their accounts, or try to undermine the accusers. He could leak information to another outlet to blunt the story's impact, or preempt publication by rushing out some sort of statement of contrition. The journalists had to protect the victims and the article. 6 people, all with some form of authority and some final responsibility for guiding the Weinstein story safely into the paper, sat in Bakay's office. Bakay was the boss, the journalist charged with supervising the entire encyclopedic newspaper every day. The ultimate calls were always his. But Corbett had guided the project from the beginning, and Bakay relied on her in part because her instincts were a little different. They were in running conversation with Matt Purdy, who amid the tumult of supervising many stories across the newsroom, was still keeping close watch on the investigation. But Jody and Megan as reporters had their own form of authority and responsibility. They had gathered the information. They had the relationships with the sources. They were writing the story. Their bylines would appear at the top, and they would take a great deal of the blame or credit for whatever happened. The 6th figure in the room was David McCraw, the Times attorney. He was there to keep the paper out of legal trouble, so no one present wanted to reject his advice. Corbett felt they needed to give Weinstein 48 hours, as much for the journalist's sake as his. They would need to be able to say they had done things right and avoid giving Weinstein an opening to say they'd been unfair. To Bakay, that seemed like too much. Nobody in the group trusted Weinstein, but he was the most suspicious. His instincts told him that Weinstein was just going to run out the clock. Besides, the team figured that however long they gave Weinstein, he would take more time. This was a negotiation, and the journalists had to start on the short side.
Very interesting. We just heard in the clip that your instinct, Rebecca, was a little bit different. What do they mean by that?
Well, so there was this question of how much time. And so in this meeting with the reporters, Dean, Matt, me, and David McCraw, our fantastic lawyer, we talked about various possibilities. And there were 2 things. Sometimes when we are compelled to go to anyone we write about and present our findings and give them a chance to respond. And sometimes that can change what you think you know, and it requires more reporting. Sometimes it means you have to adjust some things in a draft of a story, and that you also, with a story subject where you don't know what they might do, or they could somehow release something publicly. That's often when you're dealing with stories about the government or government officials. And we know that Weinstein had a history of going to other news outlets to get favorable attention. So anyway, I also knew that the story wasn't completely ready, that there were still tweaks that we had to do. And I didn't want to jam us up and somehow feel compelled to do it, give him 24 hours, hear what he had to say, and then race it into the paper. So I was arguing for 48 hours, which David McGraw, the lawyer, also felt was appropriate. There was some push for 24 hours, and we landed on the 48 hours in the end. And we actually published pretty soon after we got our final responses from Weinstein and his team of advisors. And I think he actually was surprised that we published that quickly.
Right. Did the responses have any effect on the story or on the publication or not?
Well, not really, in that obviously we had to give him fair comment, but he and his team did not present factual information that would have changed anything we said. There were blanket denials and, rejections of assertions, but there was nothing, counterfactual that would have changed what we said. And when we deal with story subjects, sometimes they do present information that really changes our thinking or makes us take something out or add something in, and that did not happen in this case.
Right. How do you maintain the balance between bringing the factual, accurate information, which sometimes can be, a bit dry in other cases, and forming a narrative? People struggle, or journalists seem to struggle sometimes with that balance. Is there a golden rule that applies to that problem?
Well, I think that you're trying, for the most part, to tell a story. And that a great example of really complicated material was the story that other members of our team did a couple years ago about, I referenced it earlier, about Donald Trump's narrative. And that involved an incredible, it was all built on, incredible diligence by our reporters of acquiring and then studying all these incredible financial documents and doing all sorts of really complicated reporting. It was like a model of forensic financial reporting. But they told the story as a tale. It wasn't built on this document, that document. The documents buttressed the story, but it was the story. Here's a guy who's told, bragged that he's a billionaire because he was a successful businessman, all self-made. And the story was completely the opposite. And it was built on what he said, what he did, how he, acquired his money. It was a tale. It was incredibly engaging. It was a 14,000 word story. And you read it from beginning to end. With this story, with the Weinstein story, this wasn't complicated material. I mean, sexual harassment or sexual abuse is not a dry subject. But again, we told it, it ended up having, an anecdotal lead about these serial incidents at one hotel where Weinstein often worked from. And the story was a mosaic of different sorts of information. Some of it was from documents that we'd seen or had access to, settlements, memos. Some of it was on-record interviews. Some of it was, what other people said about him, who had worked with him. So it wasn't like a perfect narrative of where it's, all based on one character. We had to deal with many different voices, but it was very readable because of the way it was presented. There were bits of narrative in there. There were these, episodes that these women described, and often we didn't get into a whole lot of detail about it because some of the women who had agreed to speak did not want all the details revealed. but together it all added up to this very compelling story.
Right. And you talked about different voices, but you also mentioned already a character. It wasn't about this one character. But if you talk about investigative journalism about Trump, or if you talk about Harvey Weinstein,
right,
what character do you build of those people? How do you build a character?
Well, I mean, with Trump, it was easy in that financial thing. It was all about, his story, the story he himself had told, and then the true story. I mean, Harvey was obviously a character in this story, and it was about his conduct, but it wasn't. We weren't like going on a journey with him through the story. We were looking at one very important aspect of his conduct over, decades.
Was he the main character, or wasn't he the main character? That's quite.
Yeah, he was the main character, but you didn't hear much of his voice. You didn't, understand things, or we weren't presenting his point of view because he didn't really offer a point of view, because he would not speak to us, on the record until the very end. So that's what I mean. It was there were some hard news aspects of that story that had to be worked into it very high up. But it was a very compelling story because of the material, and I think the very good, presentation, different elements of it.
Thank you, Rebecca. For now, if we to look at the investigative journalism that you use at De Groene, what things should we be aware of when constructing a narrative and building characters and taking people on a journey through a story?
Well, we give a lot of attention to it at the beginning of the story, because very often of the investigation, very often it starts with documents, and with documents it's very often very difficult to tell a compelling story. So we are really looking for places to go to meetings you can describe sometimes when the journalist wasn't there, when you get a lot of input from other people. You can describe how it was or how it had been.
Is there room for how it felt like as well, or is that a slippery slope?
That's a slippery slope. And of course, in a lot of investigative stories, there are victims who want to tell their story, and then you can tell how it felt. But that's their point of view. Yeah. But the difficulty is that. When you learn people to write that way, very often it can be a kind of trick in telling investigative stories in one way. You start with some story elements, maybe one character, then you have the nut graft, and you come with the more dense stuff from the documents, then there's a character again. So. I think that's a difficulty because, we don't have so many time, and very often we work with younger reporters who really have to learn to write, and so it's very good to experiment.
How do you guide those younger reporters in order to write investigative journalistic stories that are still compelling?
We are organizing together with Investigo, a platform of investigative journalism, a masterclass investigative journalism, and then 4 or 5 young people work together for 5 or 6 months on one story. So it's really a big story, and we have be a bit for sure that there is some outcome. It don't have to be a huge scandal, but it can be about structures and then they got a lot of people people come to tell how to interview, and there's always also someone coming to tell about narrative journalism, and well, they're really making their story because, well, there are 5 people who had worked on it, so they all have their information, and then they have huge rolls of wallpaper and a lot of post-it stickers, and they have the elements of the story, and they're really building their story up and thinking how to tell it. So when you and the posters have different colors. So this is not craft. This is factual information. This is more color. This is a character, and then you can see how it works in a story.
Yeah. So the structuring and learning people those structures and applying them to a story is very important.
And especially
as well.
when people start, it's a very good way to be very aware of all the elements in a story.
Rebecca, is there room for education at the New York Times as well, or do you have to reach a certain level before you apply, and you have to be at that level when you start?
Oh, we certainly hire younger reporters, and we actually have fellows, like 2-year fellowships, and some of those people go on to become staff reporters. But we have ongoing training. I do some editing workshops, and I do some writing workshops as part of our education program. We have all sorts of ongoing seminars all the time. And some of our most experienced reporters and editors participate in those, as people who want to learn from their colleagues. And so there's plenty of room for that. If I could just go back, can I enumerate on something Sandra said? Just about the construction of the stories, that, in the Weinstein story, what was one of the narrative devices of that was showing the patterns, right? The patterns of his abuses, of his alleged abuses, and that there were these 2 categories. There were actresses who he came across, in his work, but then there were his own employees, and there were arguably as many of them harassed or abused as the actresses. And it was showing the patterns of how he would do it in the same places and in the same ways. And then there was a pattern of silencing. And how that was done through settlements, through threat, through intimidation, and how only a handful of people, inside his company, many people had suspicions, but they didn't really know for sure. And some of those who did, wouldn't do anything about it. So it was really sort of showing, sort of how this worked, and how, and to some extent how it was enabled, but then we did a much deeper story on the enabling, because we just could not do all of that reporting initially. But that was a very powerful second story.
Well, and it enabled people, or empowered people as well, when they wrote the story, to come forward, something that hadn't happened before, to come forward and share their own stories as well. But if we take another step back, it was a featured article, and when did the realization come that it could turn into a book?
Well, I think that Jody and Megan, after the story broke, and for a while things were really crazy because there was more Weinstein coverage we wanted to do, and particularly that enabler story. But there were, a number of stories we did after the first story. We were getting tips all over the paper and through our tip line, but I think they heard, fairly early on from agents, and Jody had written a book before, Megan had not. And I can't remember the exact timing, but and the idea of the book was to sort of write the backstory and sort of how you do investigative journalism. And it's turned out to be of great interest to, what we call civilians, non-journalists. But even in our newsroom, many people who read it said, and who don't do investigative journalism themselves said, wow, I learned so much from reading that. I didn't know that, you did this or that you did that. So it was.
Yeah. Were you involved in the development of the book as well?
I was sort of called in to be a reader of it as it was going along. And then I was asked to take more of a role in just engaging with them about some of the questions about, what's the best way of presenting this information? What do you think about this chapter? Whatever. So I was sort of an outside editor. They had an actual inside editor at their publishing house, but I provided a perspective both of knowing the material really well, but also because the New York Times was a character in it, sort of seeing it from the New York Times perspective as well.
May I say something?
Of course,
because it was compared with it was what they said, it was a kind of female All the President's Men. And why? Because well, it's of course a good way to make a narrative of the investigation itself. So main characters are also the journalists in the book, and well, that makes it like a kind of thriller.
Yeah, I think.
Of course, you know the outcome as a reader, but it doesn't matter.
But still, the construction is very interesting as well, and the fact that the New York Times is a character in that story is very interesting. Is an interesting choice. And Rebecca, our time almost comes to an end, but there's a quote that I would like to ask your a clarification about. It's a very inspiring quote because you said, in a lot of journalism, it's clear what the big important things are. But with investigative journalism, you have perhaps a greater opportunity for novelty, for finding new information, for telling a new story, because it takes such a commitment and you are going so deep into something that typically not every other news organization is doing. There's something very thrilling about understanding, this is how it works, and this is what the consequences of this are. And we got to show that. It's inspiring about the construction of it. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that quote, please?
Sure. I mean, the idea of investigative journalism, sometimes you're going deeper on stories that are already out there, and that happens all the time where, there's a news event and we ask ourselves, what's the backstory here? Or what were the failures that allowed this to happen? But sometimes there are things going on that no one knows anything about, and you get a tip, or you somehow discover something, or you ask a question that leads you to find something out. And I guess I'd say that one of the most impactful stories before this one that I ever worked on were pretty soon after I came to the paper. I was the editor on the NSA warrantless wiretapping story. And I don't know if you remember that. It was about how the National Security Agency was listening in to and reading the emails of Americans' international communications without warrants. And it created a huge uproar. And that story actually led to, in some ways, to Edward Snowden. It led to Cambridge Analytica, which the Times also broke with The Guardian. I was the editor of that story from our end. And these were things that were going on that no one understood or knew about or realized the consequences. And all of that was the beginning of the whole privacy, narrative. But, part of the thrilling part of investigative journalism is discovering something. And before I came to the Times, I worked on a story at my previous newspaper about the international shipbreaking industry, which was where men were killed every day, tearing apart old ships all over the world. And no one had ever written about the entire industry. And it's rare to have virgin turf in a way. But when you do, that's you're revealing something that people should know.
Absolutely. Looking back on the Weinstein story and how you broke the news, is there anything you would have done differently?
Not really. I mean, one factor that you didn't mention in terms of the timing, and sometimes there are real world factors, including competition. And we knew that the New Yorker, we knew toward the end, we'd heard about Ronan Farrow early on, but then it wasn't clear what was going on with NBC, and that we never publish stories before they're ready, but when they are ready, we want to publish them. And we had a fantasy, I'd say early on, that what became that second enabler story, that we could have done the whole Weinstein story as one piece and sort of talked about the complicity of Hollywood, all in one story, but just chasing the story of the abuse and harassment and getting women to tell those stories, to corroborate them, to do all the reporting. It was not possible to do in one story that we could publish in a timely way. So it was broken up into several stories. But, that was a real world, situation, and that was fine.
Yeah. And was there a competition with Ronan Farrow in order to break the story first or to have more details, or wasn't that the case at all?
I didn't quite get your question.
Was there a sense of competition with the Ronan Farrow story, or wasn't that the case at all?
Well, there was competition. I mean, we, on many stories, there's competition. And we had heard early on that he had been doing something, but then it seemed that nothing was happening at NBC, which was correct. And he only, went to the New Yorker a little over a month before his story was published. But we had, we had spent 5 months, 6 months working on the story. We had a lot of great material. And in a way, we published, I think, 5 days before the New Yorker story published. And in a way, the stories were very complementary. They sort of reinforced each other. He had some different things than we had. We had different things than he had. We had some overlapping material. But I think that the net effect of it was that it really gave momentum to, the whole Me Too accountability issues.
It really took the joint forces almost, and that gave the story a lot of strength. Our time is almost up, but is there advice you would give people, journalists, that would like to get into investigative journalism? Is there something that you would give them as an advice?
Sure. I mean, the instinct to know more, to understand more, to dig more is what you need to have. And it requires real tenacity and to some extent grit, but it's also really important to have a newsroom that backs you up. And, I have the great fortune of working at a place that is determined to publish important stories no matter what. But one of the best ways of learning is to ask other journalists who do these stories, how did you report that? Tell me how you do that. How do you ask these questions? I still do that with stories in the newsroom that I admire, and I'll talk to, the writer and say, hey, tell me how you got that. I'm really curious about that.
And finally, to close everything off, what's the next story that you're going to break? Can we have a scoop, please?
I can't tell you that.
Oh, Rebecca, please. I thought we were friends. Now.
I'd have to shoot you. Sorry.
Oh, God. Well, fortunately, we're at a safe distance. Thank you so much for telling your story, and thank you so much for sharing your insights. Hopefully, we get to meet each other in real life when, things are differently, and you can visit us here in Amsterdam. But thank you so much for now.
Would love to. Thank you so much, and thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
Now, Sandra, thank you as well for joining us into the conversation as well. It's interesting to see what the differences between the Netherlands and the United States are. So thank you so much for your insight.
Not so often we make in the Netherlands world news. So,
but still we can strive, and it doesn't make the work you do less important, of course. And it's also good to realize, and the responsibility you take to train young journalists in order to train them for investigative journalism is very important as well. So thank you for that. Well, and that means that we've come to the conclusion of this series. because this was the third and final edition for now of True Stories Online, of the Livecast anyway. Thank you so much to Rebecca, of course, and to Sandra for the inspiring and the stories and insights. And the best of luck, of course, with your future projects. Well, every day Pakhuis de Zwijger has got Livecasts, so make sure you check the website to know what programs are on, because it's a very interesting programming and it's really important. Those are important stories to share. If you would like to make a financial contribution to the programs in these difficult times, it's more than welcome. You can go to the website www.dezwijger.nl/pay, and there you can make a financial contribution that will benefit the programs directly, and that helps us survive these difficult times. For now, this was the last episode of True Stories, and well, we'll hope to see you next year. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.